Hi, everybody. Again, thank you for being here. And I am so excited for this conversation on spiritual activism with AnaLouise Keating. AnaLouise Keating is an American academic and professor of multicultural women's and gender studies at Texas Women's University. Her work focuses on transformational studies. Gloria Anzaldúa, she's written a lot of books about her, a womanist spiritual activism, post-oppositional thought, esoteric wisdom traditions, multicultural pedagogies, U.S. women of color theories, and yin yoga. She's the author most recently of the Anzaldúan Theory Handbook, Duke University Press, and Transformations Now Towards a Post-Oppositional Politics of Change, University of Illinois Press. She worked with Gloria Anzaldúa for the last decade of Anzaldúa's life, editing interviews. Since her death, Keating has edited two of Anzaldúa's books, the Gloria Anzaldúa Reader, which I have here, this one, really good one, and The Light in the Dark, Light and Dark in English, and Luz en el Oscuro, Rewriting Identity, Spirituality, and Reality from Duke University Press. Thank you for being here. I'm gonna just jump right in. The idea of spiritual activism, it's one of Anzaldúa's signature theories, and if you could please, first of all, give us an introduction to Gloria Anzaldúa, her life, and to what is spiritual activism, because I just think it's just such an incredible concept.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for loving Anzaldúa's work and connecting with it in these ways. I think it's so vital to us as we move into the 21st century. Anzaldúa herself was born in 1942 in very, very South Texas, like sixth or seventh generation Mexican Americans, right? Like they had been in that land for a really long time, but she was, they were Spanish speaking. She experienced a variety of sorts of discrimination in South Texas in the 40s and so on, but and compiled with some health issues. So she had a lot of different kinds of hardships, but she also had this enduring sense of a desire to make a change, a desire to seek fairness for everyone, and a kind of just a real boldness. So she determined very early to become an artist. Eventually she landed on writing, and a thinker, and make change through education, through writing, through images, and so on. Spiritual activism, it landed the same way with me the first time I heard the term. She didn't know, it's a zeitgeist kind of thing. She didn't literally invent that term, right? If you Google it, it's all over the place. But she embodied it through her own, not just the hardships, but through moving through them in these very social justice oriented ways. One of the things I love about spiritual activism is the now. It's about activism. It's not just about sitting around. It's not just about meditating or whatever. It always involves action. It always involves moving into the outer world. So the spiritual is modifying it, defined in this really broad way. One of the slogans that Anzaldúa uses, that she created, is "I change myself, I change the world." It's also approaching activism and approaching life from this belief in our radical interconnectedness. Everything is interconnected. So if we make self change from that place of interconnectedness, we are also doing it in ways that foster social justice and change in the outer world. So that's like the tiny little definition of what we could talk about for hours.
Okay. Well, let me ask you then, just going on from there, many people, spiritual seekers, they don't necessarily make the transition from personal transformation to collective liberation. So can you talk a little bit more about that process of going from personal transformation to collective liberation and how that works?
Yeah, Anzaldúa herself, I think, approached it simultaneously always, right? Like very early on, she knew she was a smart kid, but her Anglo teacher made her stand in a corner because she didn't recognize the name she was called. She saw people who were smart being treated as though they were stupid. She saw this unfairness and she wanted to fight against it, but she understood pretty quickly that it wasn't enough only to do the outer stuff. You also needed the inner stuff as well. But she really approached it from this way that it's never just about the individual, right? It always involves these other connections as well. So just sitting around meditating what is that going to do?
Her, her experiences where she sort of experienced oneness, or however you want to say that, had those sort of, did those experiences make her more connected to the, I mean, I'll talk from my experience. So I've had a few experiences in my life where I see myself in the other and see the other in me and don't see those boundaries. I mean, it's just, they just disappear, lucky
Yeah.
from grace in my point of view. But if you've had those experiences and you really do see the interconnectedness, I'm wondering, one would think that would change the way you would act towards, in a more compassionate, a more caring way towards every other human being, but often that doesn't happen, like, right? I mean,
Yeah, that's very true. It doesn't necessarily happen. And I think part of what Anzaldúa tried to do with her art and with her writing was create that empathy, right? And offer pathways to the empathy. And really, we have in US culture, we have such a strong hyper individualism where we really see ourselves as self-enclosed. And if we really see ourselves as self-enclosed, if we really see the body as literally containing us, then we look at, for example, meditation or contemplation is only going within. But for
right.
Anzaldúa, even when you went within, there were these ways that you could connect back out. So she was active during like the 70s and 80s when there was a lot of separatism. You're
Mhm.
a woman, you have to only fight for women, you have to only fight for lesbians, you have to only fight for Chicanos or whoever. And because she could see this underlying interconnectedness, she never would stop with that. She was like, my best friend is a gay white man. I won't, you know, so it was a simultaneous going in and going out. And then again, through the writing, like just trying to like, you know, a lot of her work was with feminists. So a lot of white feminists were just clueless about racism. And she didn't discard them or dismiss them or judge them. She worked in part to create poetry or stories or things like that to kind of educate,
I think
to elicit that empathy.
I think that's super interesting in her writings too, is that she does, I think different than most academics that I know, because she was an academic, she does merge her personal stories and her poetry and her more academic, because she does have a whole epistemology. I mean, she does have a whole theoretical framework that she looks, which is an academic framework or an epistemological framework, she looks at the world, but that's also really merged with her personal life and her art. Could you talk a little bit more about that? Because weaving your way through these books, which you've done, it's an incredible job. And I know you said there's huge archives, even more and more work of hers that you haven't
Yeah.
yet published, right?
Yeah. So and she has actually, so she has a collection of interviews as well, which like if you don't have that, you'll love it. It's very informal. It goes all the way back to the 80s and it's conversations, and she's just so raw and open. But she has this whole thing, I call it risking the personal. And
Mm.
it's when she goes really deep and she exposes these things that are like, I can't believe you're saying that. It almost sounds like we're eavesdropping. But even as she's so very personal, she's doing it in this way that also is coming from this interconnectedness with others, so that as she speaks that personal stuff, people who are really different from her are like, oh, I have felt alienated like that. I
Mhm.
have felt, right? So they can make these connections. And aesthetically and artistically, it's pretty amazing because even as it looks so very, very personal, she crafts it. So she takes some out, she keeps some in. She's really working with it in these ways to really elicit that sense of connectedness
She
that
also
does this work.
writing, doesn't she?
Hmm?
Like, I like the idea. A lot of people don't do that, where she writes something and you see it again appear years later, and it's sort of similar, but it's also changed.
She allows the theories to grow. She treats them, I mean, it's a very animist, an animism where everything has spirit and is inspirited, even our theories are. So the theories also, or a book also, it takes on a life of its own in these ways that she didn't try to control. She wasn't one of those authors who tried to control it. If people took a theory and used it in a too limited way, like Borderlands, then she was like, okay, I'm going to talk about Nepantla. If you're going to keep reducing Borderlands only to geography, then I will talk about Nepantla. I will take this Nahuatl word, which means in between, and I will talk about it for all the sorts of liminality.
Okay, well, let's do that. So let's talk about Nepantla, because I find that super interesting. So you want to explain that she has these words, and in this book, there's like kind of a definition of all these words she uses. So we go from Borderlands to Nepantla. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. Yeah. So Nepantla is a Nahuatl word and it means in between. And it's used in lots of different ways to talk about in betweenness. So Anzaldúa she talked about the borderlands as also like a no man's land, not like the space that's not Mexico, not the US, but kind of both, but also neither. But then also a lot of times as we live our lives, we can live in these liminal spaces. I'm kind of this, but I'm also kind of that. I don't really fit with either world. So Nepantla can describe that. Nepantla is also like, I used to be a Christian. Now I'm not. What am I? I'm not this or that. Like what, where am I going? Right. So all those kinds of, I used to believe this, now I believe that. It's this space of chaos, which can be super painful and really alienating, but also when we sit with all of that, can also lead to these insights and transformation and change. And that's how she's using Nepantla to kind of get at all of that.
There's a sentence that you say, which is that Nepantla is a liminal stage of transition, and it's you, well, for instance, how we create identity in art and how we practice spiritual activism. Can you give a little insight into how that leads to creation of art and spiritual activism, being in that in between?
Yeah. So first of all, like when we think we know everything, when we think we completely know something, where is the space to grow? That's like just lecturing, that's like just sermons, that's like just forcing ideas on others. So when we open up space to be uncertain, when we really allow ourselves to explore that, doing that shadow work, then it's another way of getting past our borders and allowing for the possibility of new insight.
Let's go on to what a Nepantalara is, what you are, what maybe I want to be. Can you give a little explanation of what that
Yes.
means?
So while the word Nepantla actually has an incredibly ancient history because it is Nahuatl, Nepantleta is a word that Anzaldúa herself created. And she created it to describe people who live in multiple worlds, but never just only identify in one. So it's like a threshold person, always in thresholds. And she used the example, like this really came from her life in 1980 or 81 when she was at NWSA, National Women's Studies Association. So this is like women's studies is an academic organization, but this was like different feminists. And at that particular conference, a lot of the feminists of color decided the organization was too racist and they walked out during the conference. Anzaldúa was there and she didn't walk out, but she didn't just align herself with the mainstream predominantly white feminists either. She used her space at the conference to have a discussion about coalitions and about alliances and about how do we do this differently, right? And that's what a Nepantleta does. A Nepantleta witnesses to all sides. A Nepantleta listens, tries to understand all the different perspectives, brings them all together into a different conversational space, and allows for that magic to maybe let other perspectives emerge.
Is that a word of like, it seems like such a powerful word and so important for our time period when we need these, alliances. Is there a movement or are there other people who've taken this on or how is that disseminated?
So I would say I personally, the way I try to do it is not only in my teaching, but in my book Transformation Now, I develop a theory of post-oppositionality. I don't think us against them is going to work.
Right.
It's not going to work. We just keep, whether it doesn't matter what side you're on, if you are just going to be against something, what you're against is going to keep defining you and keep you imprisoned in that, right? So for me, it's trying to come up with these theories. And honestly, in the field I work in, which is women's studies, it's not always welcome.
Oh, really?
Oh yeah, because like there can be a lot of there can be so much self-righteousness in women's studies, absolutely, or gender studies or all of it, right? Because we think we know. So just so that's one way, is just like trying to like bring together these different perspectives. It's used in pedagogy. People think about it, I see it being used in articles on how a teacher should need to do that, right? You really shouldn't sit in a classroom and be like, I'm right and y'all are wrong. And I'm going to tell you how you're wrong and I'm going to fix it. You have to allow a space for genuine dialogue and conversation, and you have to do it from this belief that there can be inner wisdom that, yeah, everybody's got all this like crap they're getting from social media and their parents or whatever, but there's also this other space where insight can emerge. And so that's,
I want to
yeah.
ask reminds you, at this conference you were at Rice University, I know that in purely academic fields, that a lot of, and you are an academic teaching at a university, do you get a lot of pushback for talking about things that are quote unquote sort of, I don't know, not scientific or spiritual, or I don't know, I mean, how does that work in academia now, currently?
Yeah, well, ever since Anzaldúa used the word spiritual activism, that has been my biggest interest in terms of my scholarship. And for a long time, I'd say it took over 5 years for me to really even get stuff published because it was focusing on spirit. And
Yeah.
academics either view it as very irrational or they view it as part of organized religion, and they'll reject it for those things. And a lot of feminists reject anything connected with religion because organized religion is all defined as patriarchal. So I had to start using the language of epistemology and metaphysics. I
Oh,
just like the words I use to try to get it. And now, like, you can Google spiritual activism and Anzaldúa, and there's a lot more out there. And it really helped that, Light in the Dark, she's bringing it in and she's talking about it even in terms of the imaginal. So I think it's just a matter of what terms are going to land. I don't, I don't have a pony in the race for one particular word. I'm going to use whatever words are going to help communicate these really transformative ideas.
we're going to have to move on to something which I'm super interested in and has to do with my work. I did not know this existed. I want to ask you about shape shifting. I came to this from a totally different perspective, which is my tantric practice. Also, I'm kind of obsessed with Octavia Butler, and she has characters who shapeshift. Clearly, this comes from a shamanistic practice, but I'm super interested in shapeshifting, and I know that's important to Gloria too. So if you could give us a little introduction to the sort of shapeshifting as a concept and how it is both the political, spiritual, and other contexts for that in her work and in your work.
Yeah. So shape shifting is huge, of course.
I'm
It's
sorry.
very connected with different forms of shamanism. Anzaldúa actually read a lot about shamanism. She also, growing up, she had an encounter with a nawal, to be like a shapeshifter,
Mhm.
almost like a spirit animal in some ways. So she was very open. She was open to the realization that what we define as reality is actually much smaller than what reality is, right? But also then how even our concept of our body and that idea that we have this three-dimensional body and it's so permanent, and yeah, it changes, we age or we get sick, but there's this kind of permanence to it. But she herself, she had out-of-body experiences, she had near-death experiences. She writes in Light in the Dark, and she talks about it in the interviews. She had an experience when she was 3, and she was a little kid, and there was some fruit on a table she couldn't reach, and her arm elongated to get it, right? So she had these ideas that maybe the body itself was a little more expansive. Then there's a kind of shape shifting where you don't literally change your shape, but your spirit kind of flies, right? So this idea of flying into or transferring your consciousness into, say, a snake or something like that. So there's these different ways that it could happen. Um,
And so she talked about, because I had an experience when I was 5, which I talk about in different contexts, where I woke up one day and I went to my mom and I said, I see everything connected. I mean, all of a sudden I just saw all the connections, and my mom took me to an eye doctor who told me that everything was fine. And I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, I see the connections, and I still have moments where I just sort of see it, and it's not something you really want to talk about, because then people think, you're, I don't know what they think, you're imagining things, or whatever. And I've had those moments too, but I think it's really brave that she talked about that in an academic setting. And to me, when I think of, we're gonna end up with this, how does we disentangle patriarchy? And I call it re-embodying equality, which is embracing other systems of organizing the world that are non-hierarchical and more egalitarian. Part of it is this experiencing otherness. And what was that can you talk about your otherness quote that you wrote
that reconceiving the other. So it's RE with CON in parentheses, receiving the other. So it's both receiving the other, like letting the other in, but through that process of letting the other in, defining what otherness is. It's
right?
both, right? Once we stop seeing self versus other, me versus you, and look to see where's those points of blurring, where can we connect? Not sameness, but where can we connect? Once we can just like be open to the possibility of connecting, we realize it's not 100% difference as some kind of deviation, right? And it is very much based on this radical underlying interrelatedness. We're all interconnected. I get it that we're constantly told we're not, but we actually really are in many, many different ways, right? And when we can start thinking from that perspective, like very slowly shifts start to happen.
I really hope more people, dig into this, because for me, it was such a shift and so amazing uh, to learn about your work. And I never got to ask you how you were introduced to Gloria's work, but is that a quick wrap up or is that a long?
I mean, I did my dissertation on Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I was like done. I mean, like, I was looking for something closer to who I was and me, and I stumbled across Anzaldúa's work in This Bridge Called My Back. And I saw the spiritual stuff. It was like just jumped at me. But everywhere I looked in terms of the scholarship, no one talked about that. So through some really weird synchronicity and serendipitous stuff, I got to meet her, do an interview where I could ask. I see spirit here. I see a politics of spirit. What's going on here? I could ask those questions and finally get them into print. So it's that, like you look back on your life and you go, wow, these things were fated, but I didn't know it at the time.
When I first started with patriarchy, she was one of my 4 quotes in the very beginning. And I'll just read that to end because it was the first quote that I read, and I have it here because it was so transformative to me. So maybe we'll end with that quote because I think it's such a good quote. And it says, "My awakened dreams are about shifts. Thought shifts, reality shifts, gender shifts. One person metamorphosizes into another in a world where people fly through the air, heal from mortal wounds. I am playing with myself. I am playing with the word soul. I am the dialogue between myself and El Espirito del Mundo. I changed myself. I changed the world."
Yeah.
So thank you all so much for coming, and thank you. Do you have any last words?
I'm really grateful for this opportunity. I love that Anzaldúa has really resonated with you. I love that she's getting out into these other spaces. I think the fact that so many of her theories are in Spanish has been sadly detrimental to people learning them, right? It's a little bit more of a challenge for English speakers, but she has so much to offer.
It's so interesting. It just opens all these possibilities. So thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you everybody for joining. Thank you so much.